Hi, welcome to Anatomy and Physiology audio series learning module number 4, bone, skeletal muscle, and nervous tissue. So we're going to examine in a little more detail some specific tissues that you find in the body. The information in this module is not going to be on next week's test. Keep in mind it's still fair game for the midterm, but it is not going to be on next week's test. However, you need to prepare for class. So to prepare for class next time, you need to understand the material in this learning module as well as read Chapter 8, which is on the skeletal system. There may or may not be a quiz over this material, also in addition to the first exam that we're taking next time. So you still need to be familiar with the material for next class, but just keep in mind it will not appear on test 1. All right, so let's begin. So we'll start with bone. If you look at the diagram to the right, this is a diagram of a long bone. This particular bone is the one that's in your thigh, called the femur. Notice that there are two types of bone depicted. There's compact bone, and there's also spongy or soft bone. The spongy bone looks very much like a sponge. It actually has holes in it, and you would find bone marrow in these holes. Bone marrow we'll talk about in a second. The compact bone is dense and doesn't have this appearance, doesn't have this spongy appearance. And you will also notice that in the center of the bone is something called the medullary cavity. And inside the medullary cavity is where you would find bone marrow. Bone marrow, and there's different kinds of marrow. There's yellow marrow versus red marrow. We're not going to go into that. Bone marrow is a substance which is where all blood cells are born. So white blood cells are born here, red blood cells are born here, platelets are born here, and we'll talk later in later sessions about what those cells do, but they are blood cells, and platelets aren't really cells, they're pieces of cells. But all three of these cells or cell particles are born in the bone marrow. And that bone marrow is found inside what's called the medullary cavity. So if you look at a cross-section of dense bone, the compact bone, not so much the spongy bone, and you were to look at it under a microscope, you would see that there are a number of concentric rings that this is the way that bone tissue is organized. So if you look at the top diagram to the right, you can see that this is where you would find these concentric rings in the compact bone. And then if you look at the diagram at the bottom, that's showing you an actual slide. So this is under a microscope. You wouldn't see this with your naked eye. And that concentric circle right there, those concentric circles are called osteons. These little units that you find in compact bone are called osteons. Notice also, if you look back at the diagram in the upper right, that blood vessels are feeding the cells that are located in these osteons. So there are cells in bone, so this is a key concept. And these cells, of course, need to be fed. They need nutrients. They need oxygen. They need all of the things that all cells need. And to bring those nutrients to the cells and to carry away waste products, the bone is infused with plenty of blood vessels in order to do that. The function of blood vessels is to act as a delivery system, one of the functions of blood vessels, and you will find numerous blood vessels in bone. So a key concept, blood vessels feed the cells. They bring oxygen, amino acids, and glucose The bone is living tissue. There are living cells inside of bone. It's active tissue. All right, and then the picture at the right is looking at compact bone under a microscope. I already mentioned that this is an osteon, but we will talk more about that on the next slide. So bone is a connective tissue. Remember, there's 4 types of tissues, main types of tissues: epithelial, skeletal, nervous, and connective. So bone is classified as a connective tissue. Once again, to review that, cells embedded in an extracellular matrix. Remember, we mentioned much like a muffin, right? A blueberry muffin, the blueberry is representing the cells and the dough representing the extracellular matrix. In bone, the extracellular matrix contains proteins like collagen, elastin, and it also contains minerals like calcium and phosphorus. Cartilage below, on the right there, is another type of connective tissue. And notice the cells are also embedded in an extracellular matrix, but this extracellular matrix contains more elastin than bone does, and so cartilage tends to be more flexible than bone does. So once again, bone is a living tissue and it contains active cells. Please make sure that you understand that. Okay, once again, the figure at the right there shows under a slide a picture of compact bone. So if you just shaved a tiny thin piece of compact bone and you put it on a slide and you looked at it under a microscope, this is what you would see. So notice the anatomy of the osteon. There's blood vessels and nerves running through the center of these rings. And the cells are the little ant-like black areas that you see on the picture. In those spots, you would find the bone cells. The lighter colored areas are the extracellular matrix. That's where you would find the collagen and the calcium and the phosphorus. So we mentioned that bone is a living tissue, so it has cells inside of it. We just talked about where you would find those cells in the osteons and compact bone. There are 2 types of cells that you need to understand their function. They'll come up quite a bit throughout the session. Osteoclasts are one type of bone cell, and osteoblasts are the other. So there's 2 types of bone cells that I want you to be aware of, but I also want you to understand that there are other bone cells as well. But these 2 are very important in the breaking down and building up of bone, otherwise known as remodeling. And this happens during growth. It happens throughout the lifespan. It happens during healing, that these 2 cells are both breaking down the bone and building it up. So the osteoclasts, their job is to do what's called resorption of bone. Resorption of bone means that the osteoclasts are breaking down the matrix and releasing it into the blood. Okay? I always remember osteoclasts, I think of the C, I think of chew. So the osteoclasts are like chewing off the bone and releasing it into the blood. Osteoblasts are building up bone. So think blast, think build, right? They're building up the bone. And the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts are working together to constantly remodel the bone in response to the environment, depending on what's going on in the body. But they are always working together, breaking the bone down, building it back up, breaking it down, building it back up. Osteoblasts and osteoclasts work together, as we mentioned. You can think of bones as like a bank for calcium. So when you need money, you go to the bank to get money out. When you have extra money, you deposit it. It's the same thing with bones. When the blood doesn't have enough calcium in it, then the blood will borrow calcium from the bank. When the blood has too much calcium, the blood will make a deposit on the bone. And this is in an effort to maintain what we already mentioned is something called homeostasis, keeping those calcium levels within range. So if calcium levels in the bone are too in the blood, are too high, then calcium will get deposited on the bone. If calcium levels are too low, then calcium will be removed from the bone. So when blood calcium levels are low, the osteoclasts work harder, in other words, because they're breaking down the bone to release it into the blood. Remember that the bone contains calcium. So when you're breaking down that matrix, you're releasing that calcium into the blood. So the osteoclasts are doing that. The osteoblasts are taking the calcium from the blood and depositing it on the bone. So the osteoclasts and osteoblasts are working together to maintain calcium homeostasis in the blood. So the next tissue we're going to talk about is skeletal muscle tissue. So we're going to look at the cells that you find in skeletal muscle tissue. Notice, so this is a cartoon of a muscle cell. Muscle cells are very long cells. They actually they're sort of like a bunch of cells fused together, so they have multiple nuclei. The nucleus, remember, is the place where the DNA is found. They also have a lot of mitochondria, of course, because the activities of a muscle cell require a lot of ATP. Because remember, the job of a muscle cell is to contract in order to move bone. So contraction, that process of contracting to move the bones, takes a lot of energy. So there are a lot of mitochondria in order to produce all of the ATP that is needed for the muscle cell to contract. So remember, of course, that in order to make ATP, there's a process called cellular respiration that requires glucose and oxygen. So muscle cells require a lot of glucose and a lot of oxygen in order to make ATP. Just FYI, there are also other energy sources that the muscle cell may use, but for simplicity, we're sticking with ATP as being the energy currency of the cell. If you look, so this is just a cell. You can see the mitochondria, they're in green. The cell membrane is wrapped around the outside of the cell. You can see that there are these bundles within the cell. We're going to talk about those later. Those are called myofibrils, and we'll discuss them in a later slide. The dark red areas in the diagram are your endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so they have all the same parts as any cell, but muscle cells are just specialized for the particular function that they serve. Within those, what are called myofibrils, which we'll actually talk more about later, there are lots and lots of protein molecules, and those proteins, those particular proteins that you find inside of muscle cell are called actin and myosin. Okay, remember there's different types of muscle tissue. You have skeletal muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue is the one we were just looking at in the previous diagram. And that's basically the one we're going to be discussing from now on, but keep in mind that smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, even though they have the same function, which is for movement, they may be structured a little bit differently than skeletal muscle tissue is structured. Skeletal muscle is the tissue that makes up the voluntary muscles of the body, so we already discussed this. So a key concept is that muscles, what causes muscles to move is the nervous system. The nervous system and the muscular system are very closely connected because it is the nervous system that tells the muscles to move. The nervous system is what's sending the signals to the muscles to cause those muscles to contract. So the skeletal muscles, the voluntary muscles, the one that you can actually consciously decide to move, are controlled by the somatic nervous system. Okay, and we're going to talk more about the somatic nervous system when we get to the nervous system. in a couple of lectures, but for now, just know that the somatic nervous system is the nervous system that controls the skeletal muscles. Smooth muscle, on the other hand, is the tissue that makes up the involuntary muscles of the body, except for the heart, which is composed of cardiac muscle. These muscles are controlled by something called the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system controls the skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system controls smooth muscle and also, incidentally, cardiac muscle. Examples of skeletal muscles, all the muscles that move your bones. Also the diaphragm, which is the primary muscle involved in breathing. So these are all skeletal muscles. Anytime you swallow, there's a bunch of muscles that are involved in that. Those are all skeletal muscles. Smooth muscles, remember, are involuntary. You do not have conscious control. So here are some examples. Dilating and constricting blood vessels, right? You don't have control over that, right? You can't tell your blood vessels to constrict or dilate, dilate means to open wider and constrict means to close up. And you cannot do that to your blood vessels consciously. This is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and it is involuntary smooth muscle that is contracting, relaxing and contracting to cause the movement. The bronchioles in your lungs, people who have asthma, you can the bronchial tubes tighten up, and what is actually happening is that the smooth muscle that's in the bronchioles is what's contracting to cause that to happen. Smooth muscle is what moves food along the GI tract in a process called peristalsis. When you get goosebumps, the little hairs that stand up, those are controlled by smooth muscle. And, of course, dilation and constricting of your pupils is another example. Make sure you know the difference between skeletal muscles and smooth muscles. So let's look at the whole muscle structure. So if you look at the diagram at the left, this is a diagram that you're going to need to spend a little bit of time with to understand it. So if you take a muscle, a whole muscle, off of a bone, notice that it is attached to the bone via something called a tendon. The tendon is connective tissue. The muscle itself is skeletal muscle tissue. Notice there's a whole muscle there, and in the diagram there is a cross-section of the muscle. Inside the muscle, the whole muscle, are bundles of muscle cells called fascicles. So make sure you look at the diagram for a minute and you can point out where the fascicles are. Muscle cells are also called muscle fibers, and muscle cells are inside of the fascicles. So the fascicles are bundles of muscle cells, and you can also call muscle cells muscle fibers. So either one. So remember, it's a cell. We already saw a picture of it. It has mitochondria, it has cytoplasm, it has endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so that's one muscle cell. Notice it's very, very long. Okay, so inside of these muscle cells are bundles of the proteins actin and myosin, and those bundles are called myofibrils. There is more to this diagram, and we're going to revisit it during the next mini lecture, when we talk about muscle contraction. Okay, so for now, you just have to recognize that whole muscle can be divided up into fascicles, and that fascicles then are bundles of muscle cells, and muscle cells are bundles of myofibrils. This is how whole skeletal muscle is organized, and it's organized to reflect its function, which all of when we talk about muscle contraction, we'll be talking about how the myofibrils are involved in shortening in order to contract a muscle. So this is the function of skeletal muscle. So the structure here reflects the function. It's highly organized. Okay, last but not least, we have nervous tissue. Okay, nervous tissue makes up the brain, spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves. As you can see, all of this is made up of nervous tissue. So take a minute to soak that in. The cells that make up nervous tissue are two types. You have your neurons, and in the upper right there is a diagram of a neuron. Neurons are specialized to carry information. They carry signals. The function of the nervous system is not only to sense the environment, to take in information from the outside, so visual information, auditory information, taste and touch and temperature, and all this information from the environment travels through the nervous system to get processed in the brain. Also, the brain controls, we already mentioned that muscles like smooth muscle and skeletal muscle are controlled by the nervous system. So signals are also sent from the brain to the muscles in order for movement to take place. So the nervous system takes information in, and it also sends information out. And taking this information in and sending it out involve these special cells called neurons. So they carry information. Neuroglia are other cells that assist the neurons. For example, if you look at the diagram of the neuron in the upper right, there's something called a Schwann cell. These cells embrace the part of the neuron, the long part of the neuron, and they secrete what's called the myelin sheath, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the nervous system. And the myelin sheath insulates the axon, just like, you would insulate an electrical wire, right? So the myelin sheath is secreted by these Schwann cells, and it insulates the axon and helps signals to be sent more efficiently. Don't worry about some of the other terms there, because this is just an introduction, and we'll discuss the myelin sheath later on in the session. Notice that most cells in the nervous system are neuroglia. However, from now on, we will be discussing just neurons. So we're forgetting about the neuroglia for a while, and we're just talking about neurons. So we're forgetting about the neuroglia, and we're just talking about neurons. So here's a neuron now, and now we're going to talk about the parts. So the parts of a neuron, remember, this is a cell. It's got a nucleus, it's got mitochondria, it's got endoplasmic reticulum, cytoplasm. All of those structures are still in there. There are various parts of the neuron. You have the cell body, which contains all of those structures. The dendrites, which carry information to the cell body. So these are these branches that come right off the cell body, and they're relatively short. The axon carries information away from the cell body, and that's that very long, the arrow's not really pointing in the right place, it's that very, very long extension of the cell body. It's called the axon, and it carries information away from the cell body. And the myelin sheath there is a fatty coating that insulates the axon. The axon terminals are the ends of the branches of the axon. So if you look at the entire neuron, the information comes in through the dendrites, goes to the cell body, travels through the axon, and then to the axon terminals. This is the direction that information flows. What type of information? Sensory information, motor information, whatever information happens to be sent through the neuron. Neurons, not all neurons look exactly like this, but we're not going to go into the different types of neurons. All right, so if we look at this diagram, remember, information travels from left to right in this particular diagram. You have the dendrites coming off of the cell body. You have the long axon. And then, if you notice, neuron A and neuron B hook up right there at a spot called the synapse. The synapse is actually a space that exists between the axon of one neuron and the dendrites of another. That is where neurotransmitters, substances called neurotransmitters, you may have heard of them, that is where they are released, right there at the synapse. And the synapse is how neurons communicate with one another. All right, so receptors are proteins that are found in the dendrites of sensory neurons. So these are neurons that are sensing the environment. So, for example, if you look at the diagram in the lower right, you look, this is showing you the inside of the nose, and you can see that there are little dendrites buried down in the nasal passages, in the tissue of the nasal passages. And those little dendrites contain receptors that receive what we call olfactory information, or the sense of smell. So the chemicals that are in, let's say I just baked a pie, there are chemicals that are coming off the pie that we can detect with our noses, and those chemicals that are in the pie are received by these receptors that are buried in the dendrites of these, the neurons that penetrate the nasal passages. There are also little receptors on the surface of your tongue, and these receptors are buried in the dendrites of neurons that are found in the tongue. And these neurons pick up taste information from the food that you're eating or from whatever you have in your mouth. And that taste information then is sent to the brain. So receptors are found in the dendrites of sensory neurons, like taste receptors in your tongue and olfactory receptors in your nose. Neurotransmitters are substances that are released into the synapse from the axon terminal. So if you look at the picture at the right there, it's showing you, here comes the impulse, it's traveling down the axon, it gets to the axon terminal, and then the receptors that are on the next cell are going to pick up the neurotransmitters, are going to receive the neurotransmitters, just like catching a ball, okay? So if you look at the lower right, you can see that this is a picture of the synapse up close. The red balls you see are neurotransmitters being released from the axon terminals of the cell on the left and being received by the receptors that are found in the dendrites on the right. So it's just like throwing a ball right across that little space right there. So the receptors catch that information. So in summary, what you're looking at right here, the upper left, we have bone tissue. So remember that bone tissue, there's different types. There's spongy bone and compact bone. So we're looking at compact bone now under a microscope, a little thin sliver of compact bone under a microscope. And the little black ant-like structures that you see, those contain the cells of bone. Bone is living tissue composed of cells. So the cells that you find in there are called osteoblasts and osteoclasts. They have different jobs that we spoke about. In the lower left, you see a diagram, a cartoon, an idealized version of a muscle cell. So notice the cells are, this is just a piece of a cell, but they're actually very, very long. They contain bundles of proteins, actin and myosin, and those bundles of proteins are called myofibrils. The muscle cell itself is called a muscle fiber. And if you look on the right, we also talked a little bit about nervous tissue. And what you're looking at there is, of course, the neuron. Okay, and this is one kind of cell that you would find in the nervous system. So bone at the left is, upper left, of course, is makes up the skeletal system. The cell at the lower left is the muscle cell, so that, of course, is found, and this is, in particular, it's a skeletal muscle cell. Smooth muscle cells and cardiac muscle cells look a little different. So that's a skeletal muscle cell, and then to the right you see a neuron, which is a nervous cell. So all of these tissues, bone, skeletal muscle, and nervous tissue are composed of cells. Remember now from previous lectures that the cells are made up of molecules. What molecules? Phospholipids, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, right? That's what you find the bulk of, making up the bulk of these cells, right? And those molecules, of course, are made up of atoms. Okay, so that concludes this particular mini lecture.